In the deep recesses of the galaxy, far from the bustling cores of advanced civilizations, a forgotten species stumbled upon something that would forever change the course of history. A signal, faint yet persistent, broadcasted from the farthest reaches of the known universe. Its source, a small, seemingly insignificant blue planet on the outer rim of the galaxy. The signal was old, older than many of the stars that populated the galaxy, and at first, it seemed like nothing more than a relic of a long-dead civilization. Yet, there was something strange about it. The message was clear, even though the meaning behind it was lost to time. You've been warned. The species that discovered the signal, once thought to be a quiet, peaceful race, felt a deep unease stir within them. They knew that such a message couldn't be ignored. The galaxy had grown accustomed to peace, where power struggles were settled by diplomacy or, at worst, limited skirmishes. A warning, especially one so ancient, had to mean something significant, something important. They immediately began to analyze the transmission, but all their efforts only led to more questions than answers. The message wasn't simply a distress signal, it was a warning, but from whom? And more troubling, why had it come from this primitive, forgotten world known as Earth? At first, the rest of the galaxy's leaders dismissed it. A message from a species so primitive and unknown seemed laughable. They had faced much worse threats, fleets of conquerors, deadly weapons, and even wars that spanned generations. Why should they take seriously a message from a small, insignificant planet on the fringes of known space? Besides, humanity as they remembered it had never been a major player in the grand scheme of galactic politics. Their technology was rudimentary, and their civilization had been lost to history after Earth was ravaged by war and collapse. The message, many argued, was nothing more than the leftover remnants of a long-forgotten species, a glitch in the system of the galaxy. But then strange things began to happen. At first, it was minor, the disappearance of a few smaller fleets on the outer edges of galactic space. No one thought much of it, assuming the ships had simply lost contact or had suffered technical failures. However, as the days passed, the incidents grew more frequent. Powerful warships, some of the galaxy's most formidable, vanished without a trace. Entire fleets, armed to the teeth and prepared for the worst, suddenly blinked out of existence. No warnings, no signs, just emptiness where they had been. As the disappearances continued, the uneasy feeling among the galactic leaders grew. What could do such a thing? What kind of weapon could erase entire ships, entire battalions, with no effort at all? Then, the communications began to fail. Messages that had once been reliable became distorted, crackling with static and garbled voices. It wasn't long before entire systems lost contact with each other. Military lines were cut off, communication relays scrambled, and many found themselves unable to reach even their most trusted allies. Some claimed they could feel it, the presence of something beyond their understanding, a force creeping through the fabric of space itself, but no one had answers. There were whispers in the darker corners of the galaxy, rumors of ancient forces awakening from their slumber, of something far older than any known species of the galaxy. Could it be that the message was not from humanity, but from something else entirely? Something that had once encountered humanity in its ancient past? A warning, sent from beyond the stars to prepare those who would listen. But the galactic powers were divided. Some clung to the belief that this was nothing more than a trick, a desperate ploy from a species trying to claw its way back into relevance. Others believed the threat was far more dangerous than anyone had dared to imagine. The only thing the galaxy knew for sure was that whatever had started with that strange, simple warning, "You've been warned," was only the beginning. Something was out there, and it was coming closer. The galaxy was not prepared, and the clock was ticking down towards something no one was ready to face. What could it be? A force so old, so powerful, it had erased humanity from the galaxy's memory, or something far worse, something waiting for the right moment to strike. The question lingered in the air, heavy with dread. What was the galaxy not ready for? And would anyone survive when the answer was revealed? As the galaxy's leaders gathered to decipher the mysterious warning from Earth, they quickly realized it was much more than a simple distress signal. It was the key to an ancient, long-buried history. The first alien historians to decode the message were stunned by what they uncovered. Earth, now a barren and lifeless rock, had once been the cradle of a civilization far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. It was a time when humanity's reach extended beyond their home world, spreading to other star systems. These humans had been the architects of an empire that stretched across vast stretches of space, leaving their mark on the stars. But that was all in the past. Earth had fallen, and now it was nothing more than a forgotten, ruined husk of what it once was. The message carried more than just a warning. It told the story of humanity's rise and, more importantly, its fall. It was clear that the human race had once faced an enemy unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The signal revealed fragmented accounts of this terrible conflict, piecing together the story of a battle fought between humanity and an ancient species, one so powerful and so terrifying that even the galaxy's oldest civilizations had erased its name from history. This enemy, whose nature remained shrouded in mystery, was older than any known race, and it had moved through the galaxy with relentless brutality. It left nothing but ruin in its wake. As the historians worked tirelessly to piece together the remnants of the message, a chilling picture emerged. Humanity's struggle for survival had been nothing less than a desperate last stand. Against overwhelming odds, they fought back with everything they had, but the cost was devastating. Entire cities had been burned to the ground, and billions perished. In the end, humanity had no choice but to make an impossible decision, a choice so horrifying that it would haunt them forever. They unleashed a weapon, one of unimaginable power, to ensure their survival. This weapon was not just a tool of destruction, it was a catalyst that changed the very nature of space itself. It created a tear in reality, a rift between dimensions, something that no one had fully understood until now. The weapon had succeeded in driving back the enemy, but it had also sealed humanity's fate. The historians were unable to uncover the full details of the weapon's effects. What was clear, however, was that its activation had somehow erased humanity from the galactic memory. Earth was forgotten, and with it, humanity's legacy was lost. The galaxy moved on, blissfully unaware of the unimaginable events that had unfolded so many eons ago. The question remained, was this last warning really from humanity, or was it the message from something far more ancient, something humanity had once fought against, but that had never truly been defeated? As the galactic powers debated whether the warning was legitimate, something began to stir in the minds of many. The realization struck like a cold shock. This wasn't just a warning about humanity's tragic past. It was a warning about something far darker, a force that had once been locked away and forgotten, but which now, for reasons unknown, had resurfaced. Could it be that the very same enemy that had nearly wiped out humanity was returning? And if so, was the galaxy ready for such a threat? The message, encoded with the last desperate plea from a race that had sacrificed everything to survive, left more questions than answers. If humanity's weapon had indeed been the cause of their disappearance, could it have inadvertently released something even worse? The more the galactic powers analyzed the data, the more they came to understand the terrifying truth. The weapon had not just destroyed an enemy, it had unleashed something that had been buried for millennia. The great civilizations of the galaxy might have been lulled into a false sense of security, but they were about to face an ancient power far beyond anything they could comprehend. The discussions grew tense. No one wanted to believe the reality of what they were facing. For millennia, the galaxy had prospered, free from the shadows of unknown enemies. Yet now, in the wake of this mysterious signal, they were forced to confront the fact that they may have underestimated the power that humanity had once faced. And as the message continued to echo through the stars, one truth became undeniable. The warning from Earth was not a relic of a forgotten time. It was a call to arms, one that the galaxy could no longer ignore. Something was coming, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have imagined. The future of the galaxy hung in the balance, and humanity's legacy, for better or worse, was about to become the galaxy's last hope. The Galactic Council convened in the heart of the galaxy, its massive chambers filled with representatives from dozens of species, each with their own histories, cultures, and secrets. The air was thick with tension as the implications of the mysterious signal from Earth weighed heavily on everyone present. Species that had lived for centuries, some even millennia, argued passionately, their voices echoing off the cold, metallic walls of the chamber. The council was made up of the galaxy's most powerful leaders, military generals, diplomats, and scholars, all sworn to protect their civilizations. But now they faced a dilemma that no one had prepared for. The message from Earth, simple yet ominous, had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. "You've been warned." The words were clear, but their meaning was anything but. No one truly knew what kind of weapon humanity might have created, but the very idea that such a force could be lurking in the galaxy was enough to make even the bravest leaders uneasy. Could the humans have unlocked a power capable of destroying entire fleets, maybe even entire civilizations, in the blink of an eye? The very thought was enough to send a shiver down the spines of those who had long held the galaxy's most advanced technologies and weapons. There was no shortage of opinions. The debate grew heated, with factions splitting into opposing sides. A powerful faction, led by the Tarka, a species known for their warlike nature and centuries of military dominance, argued that the humans were attempting to manipulate the galaxy's governments. To them, the signal from Earth wasn't a warning, but a clever ruse, a way to force the galaxy to bend to humanity's will. The Tarkar representatives were dismissive of the idea that the small, primitive human race could have access to anything so powerful. They believed the warning should be ignored, and that the Council should continue its affairs as normal. On the opposite side, a small but influential group of alien diplomats, including those who had witnessed the Great War firsthand, argued that dismissing the message would be a grave mistake. Among them was the Zoloth, an ancient race who had once been allies of humanity before their fall, and a battle-hardened veteran of the Great War. The veteran's experience with the unknown horrors of that conflict gave his words weight. He knew all too well how an underestimated enemy could wreak havoc. To him, the signal was not to be taken lightly. It wasn't just a relic of an old civilization. It was a stark reminder of the threats that had once been forgotten and buried in time. The veterans of the war could still recall the horrors that humanity had faced. The very idea that this might be a warning about something even worse, something that could be returning to the galaxy, was enough to silence any doubts. The debate continued to escalate, and the council hall became a battlefield of its own. Those who believed in humanity's warning were outnumbered, but their arguments carried a heavy sense of urgency. The council's leaders began to feel the weight of their responsibility. Should they risk ignoring the warning, dismissing the very real threat that had once brought humanity to the edge of extinction? Or should they prepare, despite the uncertainties, and stand united against an enemy they didn't fully understand? Amidst the chaos of debate, strange whispers began to ripple through the chambers. It was said that some had already felt the effects of the disturbances spreading across the galaxy. Disappearances of entire fleets, sudden blackouts in communication systems, and unexplained anomalies in space. Some council members spoke in hushed tones, suggesting that the very forces humanity had fought against long ago might already be stirring, perhaps even awakening from the dark corners of space where they had been locked away. If this was true, could the galaxy survive a second confrontation? Were they truly prepared to face an enemy with such unimaginable power? The voices of those who dismissed the warning grew louder, but the silence of others in the council room told a different story. They knew that ignoring humanity's message might cost them everything. The stakes had never been higher, and the shadows of the past began to resurface. The council, once a place of diplomatic unity, was now fractured. Old grudges, ancient fears, and personal ambitions all mixed into a volatile cocktail that threatened to tear the galaxy apart at its seams. As the debate continued, the question remained: could they afford to ignore the warning from Earth? And if they chose to heed it, would the galaxy be united enough to face the coming storm? The answers remained elusive, but one thing was clear. The galaxy's fate had been changed in an instant, and now only time would tell if they could rise to meet the challenge, or if they would be swept away by the very threat humanity had warned them about. The clock was ticking, and the Council knew it. In the deepest reaches of uncharted space, where light from distant stars barely reaches, something ancient and powerful began to stir. It had been asleep for eons, its presence forgotten by all but the oldest records, but now it was awakening. The message from Earth, a mere warning to some, was not just a cry for help. It was a beacon, calling to something far older than any of the galaxy's known civilizations. It was a signal that had rippled through the void and reached the very heart of a force so chaotic, so destructive, that no species could hope to comprehend its true nature. This was not an enemy born of flesh or bone, but of pure, unrelenting chaos, a force that would stop at nothing to consume and destroy. The first world to feel its presence was a peaceful, prosperous planet known for its diplomatic prowess. This world, a beacon of cooperation and calm, had long been a model for galactic unity. It was a place where nations and species of all kinds met to resolve their differences through dialogue. But no amount of negotiation, no amount of preparation could have ever anticipated the horror that would soon unfold. Entire cities, gleaming with the promise of peace, vanished in the blink of an eye. The planet's advanced defense systems, designed to withstand anything from pirate attacks to full-scale military invasions, were rendered useless in an instant. For the first time in history, technology and strategy meant nothing in the face of this unstoppable force. There was no warning, no time to prepare, and no chance of escape. The very air seemed to tremble as reality itself warped and twisted around the cities that once stood proud on the surface. The survivors, those few who managed to find shelter beneath the surface or in hidden places, sent out a distress signal in a final, desperate attempt to alert the galaxy. But their cries went unheard. The moment the signal was sent, it was swallowed by the chaos that had already begun to spread. In a matter of hours, the once thriving world became nothing more than a haunting memory, a smoldering ruin in the darkness of space. The message, the warning from Earth, had come too late. The awakening had begun, and with it, the galaxy would never be the same. The destruction of the peaceful worlds sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The councils, the militaries, the diplomats, all were stunned. The unknown enemy, whose very existence had been dismissed as myth, was now undeniably real. The first reports of the assault had been difficult to believe, too horrific to process. Yet, as more and more systems fell silent, the truth became undeniable. Whatever this force was, it was relentless, and it was coming for everyone. The galaxy's most powerful fleets were mobilized quickly. Their commanders, seasoned by countless battles and campaigns, prepared for war like they had done countless times before, but nothing in their vast experience could have prepared them for what awaited them in the darkness. As the fleets gathered, ready to strike at the heart of the enemy, something happened that they could not comprehend. The laws of space and time themselves began to bend and break. Ships that were once the pinnacle of galactic engineering found themselves disoriented, unable to chart a course. The fabric of reality itself twisted in impossible ways. Time looped and stretched, light fractured, and gravity became erratic. Ships drifted aimlessly through space, their crews helpless as their very perception of the universe was shattered. The galactic fleets tried everything they could think of. They deployed their most advanced weapons, unleashed every strategy in their arsenal, but it was all for naught. The enemy, whatever it was, did not fight like anything they had ever seen. It did not rely on ships, weapons, or armies. Instead, it twisted the very laws that governed their reality. It wasn't just a physical force, it was a force that warped the universe itself, a chaos that defied all logic. Each failed attempt to stop the unknown enemy only deepened the fear that gripped the galaxy. The ancient force seemed to know no boundaries and would stop at nothing until it had consumed everything in its path. As the last reports came in from the surviving fleets, the dread became palpable. This was no ordinary enemy. It was a cosmic horror, a destructive entity that had waited for eons to be released, and now that it was awake, nothing would be safe. The galaxy was in chaos. What had once been an empire of knowledge, technology, and power was now helpless against an enemy it could neither understand nor fight. The terrifying question echoed across the stars: could anyone survive against such an overwhelming force? And worse, was this the beginning of the end for the galaxy itself? The hope that the message from Earth might hold the key to defeating the enemy was all but gone. Now the galaxy had only one chance left: to unite against an enemy that knew no mercy. But would they even be able to? As entire systems were swallowed by the relentless new threat, the galaxy found itself descending into chaos. The once proud and united civilizations that spanned the stars were now left reeling in the face of a terror they could not understand. Entire worlds vanished without a trace, one moment teeming with life, the next reduced to empty, lifeless husks. The destruction was so swift, so absolute, that it seemed as if reality itself was being unraveled. But the worst part was that no one knew who or what was behind it. There were no fleets, no armies, no sign of the forces responsible, just the eerie silence of worlds lost forever. The galaxy's greatest minds were baffled, and fear began to spread like wildfire. Humanity, once thought to be a forgotten species, was now a ghost in the galaxy's memory. The last remnants of Earth were shrouded in mystery. There was no clear evidence that they had anything to do with the destruction, no military arm, no faction, no signal emanating from the vanished planet. Humanity's disappearance had left a void, and in its place, fear grew, for nothing could explain the sudden destruction. Panic began to take hold as civilizations, which had never known a threat so vast, realized they were vulnerable. But then, in the shadows, something stirred. A group of human survivors, those few who had managed to escape the fall of Earth, revealed themselves. For years, they had been hidden, living in silence, watching from the outskirts of the galaxy, learning, studying, and preparing for the moment when they would have to step into the light. These survivors were no longer the weak and forgotten species that the galaxy had once known. They had changed, adapted, and most importantly, prepared. The very survival of humanity had become a secret weapon in itself. It turned out that the true power of Earth's last warning was not just the technology that had been hidden away, nor the history of a long-lost civilization. It was something far more profound. It was humanity's incredible ability to adapt, to survive, and to create solutions in the face of impossible odds. What the survivors had developed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They had used the time of their exile not just to hide, but to study the very forces that had nearly wiped them out. In secret laboratories, far from the prying eyes of the galaxy's other species, they had forged a weapon. This weapon wasn't one of bombs or fleets, but something far more powerful, a way to fight back against the twisted forces of chaos that had been unleashed. The survivors had learned how to harness and control the very fabric of space and time, turning the enemy's strength against itself. Their weapon was not simply destructive, it was a countermeasure, a way to restore balance, to reassert order in a universe that was rapidly spiraling into madness. Now, humanity's survivors were ready. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters. Their weapon, however, was not something they could wield alone. To defeat the unseen terror, the galaxy's many species, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, would need to join forces. The survivors understood that only through unity could they hope to stand a chance. But convincing the galaxy's powers to work together was no easy task. Long-standing rivalries, old grudges, and distrust ran deep, and the idea of humans offering their aid was met with resistance. Many still saw humanity as a threat, an unpredictable element that had once nearly destroyed itself. How could they trust that humanity had the solution when no one truly understood what had happened to Earth? Yet, as the survivors shared their knowledge and revealed the true depth of their weapon, something began to shift. The other species, battered and broken by the relentless chaos, began to see the truth. The destruction was not something that could be fought alone. It was something that required an unprecedented level of cooperation. If the galaxy was to survive, they would have to unite, setting aside their differences and putting their faith in humanity's survival instincts. And so the survivors of Earth, once exiled and forgotten, found themselves leading the charge against an enemy that had already cost the galaxy so much. The clock was ticking, and the galaxy was on the brink. There was no time to waste. The only hope for survival was to come together, to forge an alliance between species that had always been at odds, and to wield the weapon humanity had built. But the greatest challenge lay ahead. Would the galaxy's leaders be willing to put aside their egos, their hatred, and their fears in time to face the darkness together? The war was no longer just a battle between civilizations. It was a fight for existence itself, and the first step was learning to trust the one species that had always been underestimated. The silent war had begun, and the fate of the galaxy rested in the hands of those who dared to unite. After years of hiding in the shadows, humanity finally revealed its ultimate weapon, a mind-bending technology unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. It was a system that could reverse the devastation brought by the ancient enemy, one capable of altering the very fabric of reality itself. Where entire worlds had been erased, this weapon promised to restore balance, to bring back what had been lost. The technology, however, was something so far beyond the grasp of anything the galaxy's civilizations had created, that it both terrified and fascinated those who heard of it. It was no simple weapon of mass destruction. It was a weapon of restoration, a force that could rewrite the very laws of space and time, undoing the chaos the enemy had spread in its wake. What had once been thought impossible, bending reality to one's will, was now a possibility, all thanks to humanity's secret knowledge. But such power came at a price. The weapon, despite its immense potential, was not something that could be wielded by a single species, no matter how advanced. Its very activation required the unity of the galaxy's diverse powers. Every species, with their unique strengths and talents, had to contribute. Humanity's weapon could only function when all factions agreed to work together, pooling their resources and abilities. There was no room for pride, no space for old grudges. The technology was a tool of unity, a way to heal the galaxy, but it also exposed the raw, painful reality of how far the galaxy had fallen. The species that once fought each other, isolated by centuries of distrust and old wounds, now had to look past their differences and share in a common cause. For humanity's weapon to work, cooperation was no longer an option, it was a necessity. Tensions erupted as the galaxy's leaders convened once again. The idea of trusting humanity, a species that had once been thought insignificant and weak, was met with resistance. Some saw the weapon as a beacon of hope, the only way to counter the terrifying chaos that had consumed so many worlds. They believed that, with the power of humanity's technology, they could reclaim what had been lost and defeat the ancient enemy once and for all. But others, particularly those with long histories of conflict and distrust, were far less convinced. They argued that such immense power could easily be turned against them once the war was over. What would stop humanity from using the weapon for their own gain? Could they trust a species that had been absent from the galaxy's stage for so long? The fear of betrayal was deep, and it was fueled by memories of past wars and deceit. The debate was intense, with species like the Taka, known for their militaristic nature, demanding guarantees that the technology would never be used to subjugate them. The Zilluth, an ancient race with their own secretive ways, refused to share their resources unless they were assured that the weapon's creators, humanity, would never have the final say in the fate of the galaxy. It seemed as though the path to unity was an impossible one, with each faction holding on to their pride, their fears, and their old grudges. The ancient wounds ran deep, and the idea of relinquishing control over such a powerful weapon was more than many species could bear. For humanity, this was the ultimate test. They had built the weapon, but they could not wield it alone. It was a humbling realization. They had the technology, the knowledge, and the determination to defeat the enemy, but they could not do it without the cooperation of the galaxy's other species. Humanity's leaders were left with no choice but to face the painful truth. The true weapon was not the technology itself, but the trust and unity they could inspire in others. They had to convince the galaxy's powers to look beyond their differences, to see that the destruction wrought by the ancient enemy would be far worse than any betrayal that might occur after the war. The galaxy had to come together. There was no other option. The question that hung in the air was a simple one. Could the galaxy set aside centuries of distrust long enough to unite against the common enemy? Would humanity's technology be enough to bring the factions together, or would the fear of betrayal be too great to overcome? As the discussions dragged on, the stakes grew higher. The ancient enemy waited, its forces continuing to erase more systems, more worlds, while the galaxy squabbled over the weapon that could save them. The test was not only of humanity's secret weapon, but of the galaxy's very future. Could they rise above their pride and fear, or would they fall divided in the face of annihilation? The negotiations had failed. Time was no longer on the galaxy's side, and the consequences of inaction were now clear. The ancient enemy, once dismissed as a myth, had proven itself far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The chaos it unleashed continued to spread, consuming entire systems, twisting the very fabric of reality. The galaxy's greatest powers had been forced to put aside their fears and mistrust, uniting under the banner of survival. Humanity's weapon, the one they had hidden for so long, was now the last hope for victory. But the deployment of the weapon was far from a simple, straightforward solution. What the galaxy had failed to understand was that the enemy was not just a force of physical destruction. It was something much darker and more insidious, capable of manipulating reality itself in ways no one could have predicted. In the final confrontation, humanity stood at the forefront, leading a combined fleet of galactic species into battle against this ancient terror. The stakes were higher than any had ever imagined. But the war fought that day was not limited to the space above their heads. It transcended the physical realm, spanning dimensions of thought, consciousness, and reality itself. The very laws that governed the universe seemed to break down under the weight of the conflict. Ships flickered in and out of existence, thoughts and perceptions twisted, and the line between what was real and what was imagined blurred beyond recognition. To fight the enemy, the galaxy's forces had to not only battle in space, they had to fight against their own minds, their own doubts, their own fears. The true nature of the enemy was revealed. It thrived on chaos, feeding off uncertainty and division, and it sought to distort the very essence of existence. Humanity's weapon, built with the knowledge and power of survival against impossible odds, became the galaxy's last line of defense. But even with this powerful tool, victory was not guaranteed. The weapon could restore balance, but it required the combined strength, resolve, and unity of all the species that had come together. Humanity's role was not just to wield the weapon, but to inspire the galaxy to tap into its own strengths, survival, ingenuity, and the unyielding will to keep going despite overwhelming odds. The weapon alone was not enough. It was the spirit of the galaxy, the willingness to fight for something greater than oneself, that would tip the scales. The battle was fierce, with fleets clashing in a storm of light and energy, while across the very fabric of space, reality itself seemed to warp and bend under the weight of the enemy's power. Sacrifices were made. Some species lost entire fleets, others gave their lives in the fight for survival. As the war raged on, the true cost of the battle became clear. The enemy was no mere opponent. It was a force that sought to erase all that had ever been. But humanity's spirit and the unity they had helped create held strong in the face of it. They had come together, not just as soldiers, but as survivors, each contributing their strengths to the fight. And in the end, it was their collective will, their refusal to give up, that tipped the balance. When the dust finally settled, and the last remnants of the ancient enemy faded into nothingness, the galaxy was left to reflect on the true meaning of humanity's warning. The message had been clear from the start: you've been warned. But now, it became evident that the warning was more than just a plea for help, it was a prophecy. Humanity had faced its darkest hour and survived, not through sheer force, but through unity, adaptability, and the will to persevere. They had fought not just for themselves, but for the future of the galaxy. And in doing so, they had shown the galaxy that survival sometimes meant going further than any species had ever gone before, even if it cost everything. As the galaxy began to rebuild, one question remained on everyone's mind. Were they truly ready to heed humanity's warning in time? The cost of their survival had been steep, and many knew that it was only through the strength they had learned from humanity, through their resilience, their willingness to adapt, and their spirit of unity, that they could hope to rebuild what had been lost. Humanity had proven their worth, not just as a warning, but as a living proof of survival against the odds. The galaxy's future now depended on one thing: learning from the strength that humanity had shown. The lessons of the past would shape the future, and the galaxy would never be the same again.